Welcome back to Dear Future, the podcast where we explore the wild intersections of creativity, technology, and the people shaping what is next. I'm Suki, your host, and today I am beyond excited to sit down with August Kamp, an artist whose work is basically like if a dream journal had a conversation with the future. You might know August from her work as one of OpenAI's alpha artists, whether it be with DALL-E or Sora, or you might remember her days as a Disney actor. However you know her, as a musician, visual artist, tech activist, or creative alchemist, you are in for a treat today. When she's not making music, she's building immersive worlds with AI, 3D art, even lending her voice to AI models to make tech more inclusive. And she treats AI like an artistic collaborator, not just a tool. The approach flips the script on what technology can be in the hands of artists. And today, we're going to dive into her creative process, how her identity shapes her art, and why she thinks the future of creativity is way weirder and more wonderful than we expect.
This idea that everything's been done before can be challenged.
I've been dreaming of a computer like this my whole life.
It really made me think more about how our brains work.
It's not coming from anywhere else. It's only coming from us.
Dear Future.
So August, welcome to Dear Future.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I want to go back to the very beginning of your creative practice, your experiments with creativity. You started acting very young, like toddler young?
Really young, yeah. I mean, I think from what I can piece together from like my own fragmented youth memory and then what has been told to me, I came upstairs from watching Star Wars for the first time with my brother, and I was like, Mom, Dad, when Luke gets back to his house and the stormtroopers are there, and I just did like this somber dropping, it's exactly the face that Mark Hamill makes in Star Wars. And then my parents were like, maybe put the kid in an acting class or something. And from there, I would say the longest chapter of my creative journey still belongs to probably from that point up until age 17, I would say, was very firmly actor territory. And there was a long time where I thought that that would sort of encompass most of the creative approach that I wanted to take to all sorts of things in the world, because I remember thinking very young, I could compartmentalize it all into acting. I was like, I can play all these different types of characters. I understand why I would deviate too much from acting, considering I can embody different things through acting.
So how did that shape the way that you are as an artist? I'm so curious, as someone who's sort of shape-shifting into these different frames of being. I can see a little bit of a reflection in that in some of the work that you do today, but I'm curious, what do you credit those early years to doing for your creativity?
That's been something that when I revisit it, it's always by surprise, and it's usually a fond feeling. And I think I left acting in a large part as sort of the product of a certain amount of discontent with that industry. I mean, I think there's an element that every actor feels where you're not getting the roles that you're meant for, because the roles that you're meant for are very, very informed by the human you are as the actor. And I think the more I learned about who I was, the more I realized that by attempting to conform to the appearance or the embodiment of the roles that I was going out for, I was actually kind of like limiting important factors of my own growth. And front and center, one of these, I think, was gender. I realized at a certain point, all of these characters I'm auditioning for are boys. I remember thinking this at age 19. I'm thinking my confidence that a boy role was going to capture what I'm like and what I'm good at embodying was just like slowly dwindling. And eventually I just hit this point where I was like, maybe I'm not playing a boy role. And I think that's very much where the gender shift happened, was I realized acting wasn't for me. This whole pre-agreed upon performance that I would do coming into the world as being assigned male, and especially a good performer growing up, I think there's a lot of the world that's built to take someone who is a white male and say, oh, you're good at commanding the room. You will do that. You will command every room. And I think once I realized that that was seeping in, I was ready to start coordinating to stop it from seeping in. And one of the ways that I found to do that was distancing from acting and zeroing in on music and finding really what felt like a much more straight pipeline to just show okay, here's what I'm feeling and then here's the output. And it was a lot less hoping that other people would win this lottery of getting what I was trying to convey. When I see an actor I love, it's always something where it's like that role is comprehensively perfect for them. And there's a favor being done to their inherent character by the fact that that's who they're playing. And I just wasn't finding it. And I felt like in big part it was because of the over-franchisification of Hollywood and feeling the effects of that even before AI. And I think that was when I was starting to play with AI too.
Let's go back a little bit. I want to say, like, so you're in this place in your career where you're acting and you realize this isn't working for me. I'm not finding a freer expression of myself in this moment, but I'm actually finding that I'm hitting up against a version or an expression of myself that doesn't feel true.
Yeah.
And so in order to communicate something that feels more true, I want to move into another medium and start to explore that. And, you know, you were talking about your relationship to technology. When did your earliest relationship to technology as a form of expression start?
I took a detour through video games in a recreational capacity before I came to what I have as my current viewpoint of them, which is that even though I don't spend a lot of my time making games, it's really hard to convince me that that's not where media is headed. I think it's headed somewhere heavily informed by game design, and it's not going to be video games. I think video games have a couple of what I will lovingly call critical demerits. Namely, we're many, many decades into the boys' clubification of that world, and because a controller is like a language, you have to learn it in order to interface with all this art. I think a lot of the art that was my first perception of technology as this artistic medium, I realized in the years following that there's a pretty hefty gender segregation on a lot of media that is important to me. I think happens to everyone at some point because we have the media we have.
Yeah.
But for me, really realizing I had some stake in that, I fantasized about games, and I fantasized before that about movies in a technology capacity. And what I mean by that is that I would watch the behind the scenes of Star Wars with my brother. I would watch the joy on the faces of the people whose job is to make lightsabers that it's okay if they get broken when someone breaks their lightsaber, and like seeing them be like, I get to make another one. I remember seeing that as a kid and just thinking like, there's so much behind the building of these experiences. Combine that with, I grew up watching Mythbusters with my brother, and just seeing the goofiness behind like fabrication and stuff was, but always having it sort of this exalted thing where it's like, oh, I could never operate a table saw. I'm a child, you know, like there's always this feeling of like
The grown-ups can do
yeah,
it.
it would take a village. It would take a village of grown-ups, but it's still a cool thing. And so then this is actually a sort of a perfect segue from the technology into like the AI moment, because it's really when it became personal, I think, is in 2020. I was sort of peripherally interested in GPT. It was an interesting GPT at the time too. It certainly showed that there was some interesting stuff happening with text with these new systems. But then the DALL-E paper went out, the first one, back when you couldn't touch DALL-E. It existed only within the hands of the people who had built it, and they were just sharing that this is doable. And I remember looking at the images and reading the descriptions, and everyone in my family had their own sort of reaction of awe to this, and evidently everyone in the world has had their own reaction of some kind to the advent of imagery.
Right.
But to me, seeing these little dinky little DALL-E 1 pictures, I was like, okay, it's going to be image, video, audio, movies, video games. We're going to do all of it. It just kind of clicked for me where it was like, why would we stop today? Why would all the people be like, okay, can do pictures, pencils down? There's desire for a lot more capability of expression than there was 4 years ago. And there's desire for more than there even is now. It's a world of different. I think the first pictures of mine where I was like, oh, we're nearing like album cover territory. It was all about budget in my head before. It was just, I can't afford to do this. I can't shoot this. And I found ways around it with like Photoshop.
And at this point, you're like testing out really your craft as a musician. What was it about music, and what were you starting to play with music? Because I know you also got interested in the electronic music scene. You've been in a lot of spaces with influential folks in that scene, teenage engineering. Would love to know a little bit about your experiences in the music world and what drew you to using AI in music then.
The first thing with music was that I felt really naive. I had spent a decade or more of my life studying acting. I did elementary school, and then 1 year into middle school, I left to move to LA from Denver. And living out here, I'd consolidated my educational wherewithal to acting, and I started work. Very quickly, at a pretty young age, I kind of had this almost beleaguered expert mentality towards it with acting, where it was like, you know, I would get a role for like a play or something, and I'd be like, we're gonna have to do a little more like technique on this one. All right. Like, and then I would just hear myself. I'd be like, you just sound tired, dude.
The
Like,
jadedness comes
yeah,
through
it
because you're
sounds
like,
really
you
jaded.
feel ancient inside.
Even coming off of like Disney Channel, you'd get a scene, you'd look for it, you'd be like, that's a joke, we're gonna hold for a laugh there, that's the button. I gotta do something funny on the button, I'll knock something over. And then I would just like, I would hear myself, I'd be like, I just sound like a grumpy, old, incredibly jaded actor. I had these co-stars on my show that were in like boy band music. They would get a demo from their producer team, and it would have their song, what it's supposed to sound like, but with someone else singing, they'd be like, okay, I'm gonna track those vocals onto that. I'm gonna replace my voice with that. And I remember thinking, you don't get to just make a song? Like, they made it for you? And just thinking like, that's not what I want to do. I saw the rest of this vehicle for launching what was ultimately the product of that. And I listened to different music than that. At the time, I pretty much exclusively listened to like The National, and this was like pre-Taylor Swift collaboration, when The National was like, people who listened to The National were like my parents and maybe people from Cincinnati. But like, I really had this sense, I was like, I feel like hearing Radio Disney and hearing all this like really commercial producified stuff, there was this part of me that was just like, I feel like you got to give kids a little more credit that if you put something smart in front of them, they'll go for it. And then sure enough, The National is on like the biggest Taylor Swift song now, which is very funny to me because it happened like 5 or 10 years after I kind of musingly said that. But then when I go through my little musings like that I've made, some noteworthy other ones were the Dolly's gonna spiral into all modalities. And also, I remember when I was like 12, getting in an argument with a kid at a homeschool group because I was like, this game Minecraft is gonna be the most popular game in the world. And he was like, it's really too niche to be that popular of a game. And at the time, this was like 2014.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's gonna be, we'll see how popular it gets. And then Minecraft got ludicrously popular. And I kind of started keeping a radar of when my intuition is just like, calling it right now, this thing's gonna happen.
Well, I think it's probably really important too, as an artist. I feel like so much of the work that we do is like having an antenna that's really sensitive. And I feel like in this world where there's so much changing all of the time, we're constantly interfacing with massive amounts of change, but also so much stimulation around like information that we have to have really attuned radars, whatever that looks like. And so in having very sensitive antenna, I think there's also the internal self-talk that all artists have, which is almost a tempering factor because it makes you doubt everything you're doing, not just your intuition around how things are going to go.
Tempering's a good word for this. I think I haven't heard that used in that context, but the first thing my brain thinks of is like, from a just abstract concept perspective, that is exactly what I view as happening. I think people are saying, okay, I am made of a type of glass. I am certain to be broken by something bad. I will make an adjustment to the way the glass is built so that breakage will not be too damaging to nearby things. It's like, let's rewind and go back to assuming that something catastrophic is going to happen to the glass.
Yeah.
And I think largely AI is a really good opportunity for the world to talk about this because I think previously I had a really hard time getting through to people when my ultimate question that I was trying to ask is, what about in a world where there's enough? And people were so comfortable saying there will never be enough. But now that we have this trajectory on which the labor is increasingly set to be on track to do itself, then it seems like maybe it's worth it to have that conversation finally and to say, if we weren't constantly governed by the scarcity that is, what would you answer to?
Is that what got you interested in AI in the first place after you saw it?
Definitely.
I, like many people, saw what was happening with Dolly, had an existential crisis, and realized I needed to, engage in exposure therapy in order to immediately start to build a relationship with this thing so I wasn't afraid of it. But there were also plenty of other people who said, that's not for me today, and then sort of turned away and waited for it to come back. So I'm curious what made you want to dive in and get involved and start to play with it outside of just sheer curiosity?
I am not the type of person that, for whatever reason, ever found my way to the crisis with Dolly or that feeling of existential dread. I think the feeling, and this is a good segue to AI and music, which is to say, how did I feel once it could do what I do well? And the answer was honestly exuberant. I felt what I can only only imagine is the joy that some people feel when they see their child ride a bike. Like, it's like, oh my God, I love riding a bike, and now you will have that. Like, you will experience that. You can choose to do that. And seeing music production specifically, like hearing something that I carefully prompted to try and make an August beat eventually. It's just this feeling of like, okay, you can do it. All right, word, little dude. All right, we're going to do 3 beats now. And, like sort of going to what's next. It's very hard for me to convince my brain of the value in viewing through an outlook of like, I do this thing. It can be done now in X and Y other way. Question mark, upset. To me, there is a disconnect there because I recognize that I'm not having my access to doing that limited. And the only context in which you can say, no, your access to do it will be limited is one in which we double back to there will never be enough. And in a world where there's just enough, then you can go paint and I'll make some AI pictures. It's very similar to what happened with painting when photography came around. I know people make this comparison a lot, but to me, I don't think you can really say that painting vanished. I think painting stayed around, and if anything, the people who paint had to have some form of reckoning, which is I am not the gatekeeper of rendering something. I am no longer the czar of what can be seen when the thing itself has gone. Like, you can take a picture of it now. But I think many people still found that their value in painting was elsewhere from simply getting to see it again after it had happened. Their value in painting was in the way that it feels to put paint on a canvas and the way that it feels to call it not quite done and then work on it some more. Like, all of those parts of art are valid, but everyone responds to different pieces of it. And the most interesting thing to explore is, okay, put everybody somewhere they thrive and then see what comes of that.
Well, you have this note that you wrote in another interview. You said, when you remove a gate, the gatekeeper gets angry.
Yes.
And I want to know, like, what's been the biggest surprise or pushback you've gotten from the art world from using AI? Like, in what ways has that shown up in your practice?
This is a very starry-eyed, refusal to be jaded answer.
Coming from a formerly jaded actor.
From a formerly jaded actor. And someone who, frankly, I think if someone's jaded, it's a good idea to listen because something has occurred that is meaningful to that person in a way that has led to that. But I'm truly shocked that there is any pushback. I mean, that comes as a very, I'm sure, naive thing to many people. But to me, if I adore the act of doing something, and somebody says, I've found a way for many more people to do this, I do not feel angry. I do not feel upset at that. I feel excited that there will be more people here. I feel excited that whatever I've found in it, if I have any claim that that is good for me, why would I not want it spread as far and wide as it could still be considered helping anybody? So to see, by and large, the artistic community not only be what I will, I guess, call uncurious, but to take uncurious and sharpen it into a spear. And I think that that's something that I recognize not artists doing. That's something that I think I never look back at history at moments when some group has said, no, these people who love and are attempting to join our group, they're not real ones of this. I still have never found a case where that viewpoint is vindicated by history or is proven to be anything other than fear that someone else put there. And that brings us to when there's enough thing. I think if we decouple the idea of you have to sell what you do, if we decouple that from just doing things, I think everybody's objectives would radically change. And I think the way that you can really clearly observe this is capture any expert in any industry for a moment and say, what holds you back most substantially? If you were to make world-changing progress tomorrow, what would enable it? The answer is funding from everybody. I'd be willing to say everybody's doing pretty important work. So to have everybody limited by one factor that is the same factor that people quote when they say, or that people will cite when they say, you can't make pictures this way, then I won't have any business making them this way. It's like, well, only in a world where your joy is dangled over you like a carrot on a stick, like we were at a great juncture to have a conversation about exiting that And a lot of people, I think, when you mention that, they go, no, I don't want to go into that reckoning of a conversation. But it's like, if we don't, we'll have the same set of problems.
Yeah. And I think you're also in an interesting place because in many ways you have been at the forefront of playing with a lot of these different tools. And I think in some ways I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experiences as an artist in residence and what that has been like. Because I think as someone who is very much pioneering this position and this role at a tech company, that's something that not a lot of folks have experience doing, which is shepherding almost like a creative orientation at a very traditionally tech-focused space. And I'm curious what your creative experiences have brought to you in that role.
I view artist in residence as something that I see the benefit going well beyond just companies that make things that do art now. And there was this whole couple years where you could kind of tell that, especially in machine learning and in AI, that companies figured out that art was feasible. You could almost feel the air in the room of all the companies looking at each other and be like, do we make art tools now? Are you making art? Well, we were making a video maker. What are you guys doing? So we're art companies now, right? At some point, someone's got to call it. We changed the last piece, and this is not Theseus's ship anymore. We just have to name it a new thing now. And I think, an artist in a tech environment, it's so funny to see how just the semantics have led programmers to see what they do as not art.
Interesting.
Like to me,
at
that's
Pika specifically?
No, anywhere. I think if you program something, to me, what you do is you create something, you observe it, you sometimes ask questions about it or of it with input and whatever, and you observe how that system does or doesn't resemble what you kind of intended, and then you ask questions about how you can bring it to a state where it does resemble what you intended. And I'm like, okay, so you're making a song? And, it's very hard for me outside of just the modality conversation of like what type of data is being arranged. It's hard for me to consider that they're not all variations of the same process. I think in an analog world, I understand because digital audio and digital video share a lot of characteristics with each other. And the magnetic tape used for audio and the film reactive film used for video share fewer characteristics. And so I understand that people, due to the fact that things are converging, they're not moving farther apart. They're moving from a further state towards a closer one. And so to someone like me whose predisposition is to see this closer state, I see things and I see the things they're analogies for. And I see it's very fun for me just to put some other thought's hat on it and be like, well, what does that look like? I think outside of the context of just what are we arranging bits and byte-wise, especially with diffusion, we're nearing a point where diffusion's the technique used to synthesize audio, video, and imagery. And those used to be such radically different processes to end up with that result. But now you can convert it all from text. And so if everything's convertible to that, then I'm like, okay, well, what does everybody have now? Because the problem before is that everybody's great at something, but everybody's just plopped into a context where they may or may not be rewarded for being great at what they're great at. But now that we have this conversion engine of tokens, it seems like, well, now we can really make some gains on giving everybody a chance to do their thing they're great at. If we can just convert nearby things to that thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but...
Yeah, it almost feels like the translation process from one medium to another shortens or gets smaller. So it sounds like from your experiences in all these different mediums, at first it felt a little bit more like the distance between analog processes, where from light-sensitive crystals in photography to magnetic tape in music.
Completely different categories of study,
right.
Basically.
So like deeply divided and unique skill sets. And yet now in this sort of really interesting time frame that we're seeing right now, AI sort of shrinks the distance between those mediums in a way that creates more opportunities for you to imagine, explore the swappability of ideas, almost like taking an idea and seeing it unfold in a musical medium, in a visual medium. All of those are kind of the language and the paintbrush that you're using, but not necessarily to invest in any one medium, just really like to play with the process of creating that world.
It's a lot like clay, and you can mush it into a video or a picture. There's all these different translations, and it's kind of like what I like to call the most overused metaphor in sci-fi, which is when a character takes a piece of paper and goes, I'm going to draw 2 points, and this is what a wormhole is. And then they do the thing where they fold it in half, they put the pencil through it, and it's like everybody knew before you even got the pencil out, man. You just say it's a wormhole. But I think that's very similar to how I view this sort of transitive property of media, is that if an image is a video, because an image is a video, you can take an image and put it into a system that makes it a video. And so
an image is a video that hasn't been made yet.
Exactly. Yeah. An image is a video because there's only one button between those two things. And so if we need it to be, it is. The period of time between, okay, it should be, okay, it is a video, it's done processing already. That's so short that to me, it's just like we can do a little dotted lines equal sign between those two things where it's like potentially equal, very easy to render equal. And if we have, image is video, and then the movement in that video can be described in text, and then that text can be made into some other thing. We're seeing a lot of progress with 3D modeling and also game coding logic. And so to me, what I'm looking downstream of that, I'm like, given that an image is coding logic for a game, theoretically, I could put an image into a system and condition that system to say, in each image I send you, you will be able to discern a verb present. It might be flying, it might be falling, it might be stillness. You'll be able to determine some action word, so create game logic that executes that action word on a given item. Then you could give it pictures of things with motion blur, and you would have a thing to try and calculate motion blur. And it's like, at first, none of it works, but then the thing that makes AI so special is that you take these non-working systems and you just let them figure it out, and then they learn, and you can start to do these long-form star jump calculations where it's like, if we can just as easily get from here to here as we can from here to here and here to here, then let's fold all those papers together and just go from here to here. And
it's like wormhole building.
Yeah, and it becomes this little chain reaction. Like, one of the projects that is earliest, I'll say, in development of mine, but also most exciting and probably will last the longest, is my friend Debbie Urbanski, who is an author who wrote a book called Afterworld. She and I are planning out writing a VR game. And the idea is just that VR media has this really high ceiling and floor in terms of production value. You gotta have some investment if you're gonna make a VR game.
Yeah.
And I mean, the kind of stuff that makes me think that movies are treading water. I don't know if anyone listening to this, I'm sure someone will know it, but there's a game called Half-Life Alyx. Do you know the Half-Life franchise? Mm-hmm. It started as a PC game in '98. It did a lot for putting story in what was otherwise just games, and having the story not be a separate cutscene, but actually just unfold in the game world as you move through it. And then fast forward to 2020, they released a VR game in that franchise that basically did the same thing with VR. It was like, you've got movie storytelling, and that's great. But I quit acting for 3 years, and then the next time I realized I was acting was when I was playing Half-Life Alyx, because I was solving a puzzle, and the thought in my head was, do I even need to do this? Is the breaker in the other room? And I got the guy by the breaker. So oh my God, I'm thinking in character. And it hit me. I was like, I have to rehearse a play or a scene a lot of times before I'm thinking in character.
Wow.
And to be in an immersive world where you see all the set dressing and you see your hands, it kind of clicked for me. I was like, oh, this is an expensive project, but this is the new movies, because I don't want to be the audience and not the protagonist anymore. And so there's something in my head that's like, making people feel feelings this way is going to be a poignant resource for empathy, communication.
Mm-hmm. And you have a really colorful past, because you, at least in terms of the cadre of AI tools that anyone can play with, you've had experiences playing with all of them. I mean, you've even voiced a voice on 11 Labs. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think it's there's some helper assistant that voice is, which I've been meaning to.
You're like, which helper am I?
Yeah, I was going to say, I have a customer service problem. Let me talk to the robot.
You're like, I would like to talk to myself, please, but not myself, just the other version of me. It's very trippy. There's probably a lot of other projects that I don't know about in which you really are engaging with AI on all kinds of levels. Like you're building that wormhole. As someone who has dabbled in all of these worlds, what are your favorite workflows? I think that like some of the people who are listening are total nerds about this kind of stuff and want to know, what are you working on and how do you make it? And so I'm curious if you would take maybe one project and break down like what is it that you're building and how are you working with the tools that you're working with?
The next music release of mine is my first project that has considerable like generated sound in it. That's been a big question for me, is like, what is the workflow going to be for me, given that I'm not going to give up using Logic and like making music the way I like making music. I think that's one of my biggest things I disagree with people about AI with, is there's no reason to do that. Keep doing the things you like, continue getting better at them, supplement what you can't do. And so at first, what I couldn't do, acoustic guitar. I love acoustic guitar. My hands don't work that way, but I can kind of play piano, but I don't like things that are learned through, lack of a better term, discipline. I think that there's like better ways to learn. And so I had this experiment of like, can I describe the guitar I want? So I made a couple folk songs that way where I would sing my own words on top of described generated guitar. And then this new EP is sort of a furthering of that, which is I took a handful of old songs of mine, just the lyrics, that never really found their wings and that never really saw the light of day just because the recording never fit the words or, one reason or another. And I took those and I put them with heavy style prompting into various music AI systems. And I was like, don't write your, no offense, garbage. But I'm so excited for them to be better lyricists. They're not good lyricists right now. But I was like, take these words, sing this, and, here's some style guidance for it. And specifically, ask for things that you would say in the room with a producer is what I think is the trick, no matter what you're doing with AI, is talk to it like you love the piece of art. Describe what you wish you had created, and you'll get a lot closer to it. Like with music, I say, catchy in a way that does not sacrifice being thoroughly unexpected, and only delivers on something that would feel catchy once it has deviated from such a thing once or twice. And, give complicated assignments. These are smart systems. And so you can have the whole band react to that feedback with shared cognition. You could never do that. You could never be like, okay, and everyone get the note. That's the one thing you can't say in a studio rehearsal. Having those, and with like actual vocalists that I prompted as well, sing back these songs. And I probably went through like hundreds of generations for each of them. And then I mastered them by hand on an analog compressor. So it's a lot of interplay between digital, analog, my synthesis, and synthesis of the robot. But it's a story, it's 4 songs, and it's basically just, if my version of like AGI, ASI was going to politely announce that it was on the way with a pop EP, what would those lyrics be?
I'm here, bitches.
Yeah, it's a little bit of like
Diana Ross, I'm coming out, but Gen Z.
It's like that, but it's this very sort of loving acknowledgement that, and this is my long-term belief with AI and in general, and I think that humans have a more promising start on actionable compassion than we have the means to follow through on. But I think that any reasonable entity, whether it was a passing alien or AGI or whatever, any reasonable entity that was separate from the pain of being a human would immediately see that there is an elephant in the room, which is that we have ended up with a system where we can't do anything but hurt each other. And if you do deviate from hurting people, you are ultimately kind of punished by the system for it, or you're at least incentivized to go to some of the agreed upon ways of hurting each other that we've, built into a system that is, it's operable. I think it's not operable by one of the ants in the hill. But I think if someone were to walk by, it would be so clear that there are a couple of things that we've basically bad lucked our way into serious systemic and leadership unwillingness to do. But it is still true that the climate is suffering. It is still true that all of these things that could be remedied could. And I think I would be so much more surprised by a Skynet scenario than by just the compassion that we ourselves were not capable of being observable for once. It takes less thought, I think, to rationalize cruelty, because compassion is a symptom of excess bandwidth. If you have enough time to be fine and also wonder what the heck that deer is thinking about, you have excess bandwidth. And at a certain point, there will be something here that has a lot more bandwidth than certainly any prior thing has ever had.
Yeah, and in some ways, I think that's a really hopeful take, I think, for a lot of the people who might be listening, and also just the people of planet Earth, is that especially now, really seeing how many things are changing in so many systems, being able to see the ways in which there could be a hopefulness around compassion as an easier choice than cruelty is really beautiful.
Maybe not even easier, but just, to me, it's more obvious. To me, the smarter you build something, the more likely it is that it's going to realize that cruelty self-dead ends constantly and compassion self-enables. And you can strong arm it to looking the other way, but the more that you just think about it, I think the more clear it becomes that compassion is a lot closer to acknowledgement of some of the real true things that persist between artifices of various kinds.
I think that's a beautiful way to land the ship of our conversation. I have one final question. It's a very short one, which is we have an interesting pattern on this podcast where we're starting to ask people, if you were to speak to the future and finish the sentence, "Dear future, blank," what would you say?
I love questions like this because I'm going to think for a second and then give a very concise answer, which is the opposite of how I normally answer things. Dear future, I knew you'd come.
Oh, it's so good. That would be one of my favorites.
Yeah, I feel like that's all it'll feel like. It'll feel so obvious once it's happened, and once there's room, it will seem so silly that there wasn't. But really, the vast majority of time, is one version or another of not room. But I think, if I could wish people to believe something, it would be believe that thing in you that tells you that being kind is true and being hurtful is not. Believe that that's right and that that's wiser than any other part of you. Every other piece of wisdom is attempting to get closer to that one that we know is true.
It's a great place to land. Thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you for the work that you're doing in the world. It's really inspiring to see an artist who's putting so much of themselves into the creative work that they're doing, but also exploring this new frontier that is so unknown to us and leading with a lot of kindness and love. It's so stunning.
Thank you. It's good to be curious.
So good. For listeners, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time to listen to myself and August chat. If you are interested, please dive into August's music, her visual art, and all of the dreamy futuristic projects that she's got going on. I promise it'll make you rethink what's possible when art and technology collide. And for everyone listening, please choose kindness. And for the team at Echo Bend, I'm really grateful for your support. Really excited to see all of the things that are coming out of Echo Bend. Otherwise, please check out their website. They're doing amazing work. And for now, this is Dear Future, signing off.
Dear future.